Hello, I'm Larry Hatch, Safety Manager for Halverson. In this presentation, we're going to talk about the Task Hazard Assessment form. Here at Halverson Company, we want all of our employees to have a safe work day. The work we do can be dangerous, so it's important that you be aware of these dangers so you can keep yourself safe. Another name for dangers is hazards. As a company, we work together to identify these hazards and figure out how to eliminate them. If the hazards can't be eliminated, then we decide together how to work safely around them. When you arrive for your work shift, your supervisor will assign you a work task. Most tasks are worked on by one or more workers. Your supervisor will tell you who you will be working with. This is your work crew for this task. Working together as a crew, you will fill out the Task Hazard Assessment Form, or THA. This form is used to help you identify the hazards before you start working. Taking the time to correctly fill out the THA is one of the most important things you will do to have a safe work day. You begin by filling out this form by entering the job name where you are working, the job number, and the current date. Next, I would like to point out the instructions or procedures for filling out the rest of this form. Let's focus on a few key sentences. As I said earlier, when you arrive for your shift, your supervisor will give you your work task and assign you to a work crew. Together with your crew, you will use this form to develop a safe plan of action. So now on the form, enter in the work task you are assigned into this section. Let's say that your supervisor wants you to build a handrail today. Notice that I've also put in the number from the work plan that is associated with this task. If your supervisor gives you a task number, then you enter it in here with the general description of the task. Now we drop down to the most important part of this form. This is where we start thinking about safety. This section is where we develop the safe plan of action. As the name implies, this is where we plan for safety. We want to begin by breaking our work task into smaller steps. In this example, we decided what are the main steps in building handrail. The safe plan of action refers to this as the critical steps. For the purpose of this presentation, I have identified 4 steps. Cut the material, fit them together and weld them, clean up the welds with a grinder, and paint the finished product. There may be more steps, but don't get too detailed. We are looking for the major steps called critical steps. Now that we have identified our critical steps, it's time to think about the hazards for each of those steps and how to protect ourselves from those hazards. This section is where we write down the hazards and controls. Again, the control is how to protect yourself from a hazard. An example of a hazard and a control would be a tool falling from a height towards your head. The hammer or a falling object is the hazard. Wearing a hard hat would protect you from the hazard, so the hard hat is the control. What we need to do is to identify the hazards and controls associated with our work steps that we just wrote down. The tables on the rest of the form are here to help us do just that, identify the hazards and figure out how to control them. There are several tables included on the THA. This one is titled Tools Needed. It is a list of some of the tools that you may use and some of the hazards for those tools. Look at the list of tools on the left. Going through these tools, you may find ones that you will be using to perform your task. For instance, welding is one of the work steps we wrote down. Looking at the tool welder, go across to the right, and you can see possible hazards like fire, fumes, or burns that are associated with this tool. The next column can help you identify controls for those hazards, like using ventilation or welding shields. Another tool we will be using is grinders, or as we sometimes call it, a metabo. In this example, we'll be using a cutting wheel on a grinder or a metabo to cut the materials to make handrails. That is the first work step we have listed. Some hazards with using a grinder are fire, explosion, and flying particles. There are also some controls listed for these hazards. Using these lists can help identify which hazards we may have to deal with, which we can then use to fill out the safe plan of action. We may also want to use some of the listed controls as controls that we want to use in our safe plan of action to protect us from the hazards we will face with this work task. You can continue going through the tools, helping to help you identify any hazards from tools for each of the work steps. Notice that for our last work step we wrote paint. Paint is not really a tool and is not included on the list we were looking at. There are other tables on the back side of the form to help identify hazards and controls. One of these discusses materials. This helps remind us that many materials may have hazards. Paint is one of these. No hazard is listed, but we are reminded to make sure we have SDS sheets available in case of exposure to these materials. So I'm going to put in paint chemicals as our hazard, and with my crew we decide that gloves and dust masks are ways to protect us from these hazards. Now we have developed our Safe Plan of Action, or SPA. We have identified the major work steps, the hazards for each step, and controls, or ways to protect ourselves from these hazards. Also included on the THA is this checklist to ensure that we have the required permits and forms to do the job. These include items like hot work permits or pre-lift forms for crane work. Look at this list and check off any forms you need. Then let your foreman know that you need those forms as part of your preparation. Note that some of the forms on this list require office authorization. This means that if you need a confined space entry permit, or if you are doing a critical lift, you need to review these forms with the Halverson Operations Manager or the Safety Manager prior to the work. This section is a visual checklist to help identify some of the PPE you will need today. Check the boxes on the needed row for the PPE you need. This last row in this section is for PPE inspection and is filled out by your supervisor. Your supervisor doesn't inspect your PPE, that is your duty. Each person inspects their own PPE. The supervisor checks off acknowledging that the PPE was inspected. This box is a final review. By checking each box in this list, you acknowledge that you looked at the table and thought about the different types of hazards that each table helps bring to your mind. Notice that this last checkbox refers to the Safe Plan of Action from page 1. It says that the Safe Plan of Action, or SPA, has been completed, reviewed, and discussed. Who do you discuss your Safe Plan of Action with? First of all, every member of your crew should be contributing and discussing your Safe Plan of Action. Your supervisor will review your form and contribute as necessary. But you should also make sure to include your plans with the facility management or person assigned to work with us. They will have valuable input as well, such as if we need to use any of their forms instead of ours. Once you complete your form, you can take it and discuss it with the facility management involved with your work. Now the form is complete, except for this portion. This is where each crew member signs off. Notice that signing this states, "I have participated in the development of the Safe Plan of Action, and I agree to follow this plan." Finally, the supervisor reviews the THA to make sure the task is the one he assigned and that the work steps, hazards, and controls are correct to safely and properly complete this task. The supervisor signs off on the THA and includes it in his daily report. This may seem like a lot of work at first. However, those who have had the chance to work with this form and have become familiar with it can often complete it in 5 to 10 minutes depending upon the task. One final note on task hazard assessments. If you complete the assigned task and your foreman gives you a new task, you must then complete a new THA. That is the last thing I wanted to show you from the instructions. If your foreman gives you a new task, take a few minutes to go through this process and determine how to do your new task safely. The task hazard assessment is one of the most important practices you can do to help keep you and your crew safe on the job. Please take the time to carefully complete this form. Thank you.